After the Battle of Monmouth in June 1778, the American Revolution was entering a completely new phase. Washington's army had survived Valley Forge, endured the fighting at Monmouth, and emerged as a more disciplined force. But the greatest change was happening far beyond the American battlefield. Across the Atlantic, France had decided to openly support the American struggle for independence. For years, France had watched Britain's conflict with the 13 American colonies. Britain was one of France's greatest rivals, and the American rebellion presented France with an opportunity to weaken British power. But France had initially been cautious. Supporting the Americans could be expensive, and openly fighting Britain could turn a colonial rebellion into a much larger European war. Then came Saratoga. In October 1777, American forces captured General John Burgoyne's British army after the Saratoga campaign. The victory demonstrated something France had been waiting to see. The Americans were not simply resisting Britain. They had shown that they could defeat a major British army. For French leaders, Saratoga changed the calculation. If the American cause could survive and defeat British forces, then supporting the revolution could become a realistic way to weaken Britain. In February 1778, France formally recognized the United States and signed treaties of alliance and commerce with the new American government. The agreement transformed the revolution. The Americans now had a powerful European ally. But France's involvement went far beyond diplomacy. French money, weapons, supplies, military personnel, and naval power could now be used against Britain. For Washington, this created new possibilities. Britain could no longer concentrate its military strength entirely against the American colonies. The Royal Navy would have to watch the Atlantic. British commanders would have to worry about French forces in Europe and the Caribbean. And British resources would have to be divided across a growing number of battlefields. The war was becoming international. French preparations accelerated. In French ports, sailors loaded supplies aboard enormous wooden sailing warships. Cannons were inspected, rigging was repaired, barrels of provisions were brought aboard. Officers studied charts and prepared their fleets for operations across the Atlantic. The French Navy was one of the most important weapons France could bring into the conflict. For years, Britain had relied on its powerful navy to move troops, protect trade routes, supply distant colonies, and maintain communications across the empire. Now, France could challenge that advantage. British commanders understood the danger. The Royal Navy remained one of the most powerful naval forces in the world, but it now faced a serious new opponent. French and British ships began operating across the Atlantic, and the ocean itself became another battlefield. The consequences reached far beyond North America. The Caribbean was especially important. Its islands were valuable because of their sugar production and enormous economic importance to European empires. For Britain and France, controlling these islands could mean controlling valuable wealth and strategic naval bases. French forces therefore had reasons to attack British possessions in the Caribbean. British commanders, meanwhile, had to protect their islands from French attack. The struggle for the Caribbean became another part of the wider war. Ships carried soldiers and supplies across thousands of miles of ocean. Fleets escorted transports. Warships searched for enemy vessels, and naval commanders fought for control of important sea routes. When opposing fleets met, the battles were brutal. Wooden ships maneuvered under sail while cannon crews prepared their guns below deck. A broadside could send dozens of cannonballs toward an enemy ship. Smoke filled the air. Sails and rigging could be torn apart. Wooden hulls could splinter under repeated fire. For sailors aboard these ships, naval combat was a terrifying test of discipline and endurance. But the global conflict extended even farther. Britain and France were rivals not only in America and the Caribbean, but also in Europe and India. Their competition for influence and territory had already been developing for decades. With France now openly at war with Britain, those rivalries became connected to the American Revolution. The conflict was no longer simply about 13 colonies fighting for independence. It had become part of a much larger struggle for global power. Yet North America remained the central battlefield for American independence. Washington still faced a powerful British army. French support did not immediately defeat Britain. The Continental Army still needed to fight. British troops still occupied important positions, and the British government was determined to continue the war. But Britain's strategic situation had changed. Before France entered the war, Britain could focus much of its military attention on suppressing the American rebellion. Now, every major decision had consequences somewhere else. If British forces concentrated heavily in America, French possessions or trade routes could become vulnerable. If the Royal Navy was sent toward one theater, another could become exposed. British commanders had to protect their empire while continuing the war against the Americans. This created a difficult strategic dilemma. Washington understood the opportunity. French involvement could force Britain to divide its resources. And the longer Britain had to fight on multiple fronts, the more difficult the American war could become. But Washington also knew that an alliance alone would not win independence. The Continental Army still needed to survive. It needed supplies. It needed trained soldiers, and it needed opportunities to strike British forces when conditions were favorable. Meanwhile, Britain's strategy in North America was beginning to change. With the French now involved in the war, British leaders increasingly looked toward the southern colonies. They believed the South might offer advantages. British commanders hoped to take advantage of Loyalist support and regain territory where they believed American resistance could be weakened. The focus of the war would gradually begin moving south. For the Americans, this would create a new and dangerous chapter. The fighting that had dominated New England and the middle colonies would increasingly spread through the southern colonies. The future battles would involve regular armies, militia, loyalists, continental soldiers, and eventually powerful French forces. The revolution was becoming larger and more complicated. From the fields of New Jersey to the ports of France, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Caribbean, from European waters to India, the rivalry between Britain and France was now connected directly to the American struggle. And this changed the meaning of the war. The Americans were still fighting for independence, but now their struggle had become part of a worldwide contest between European powers. France wanted to weaken Britain. Britain wanted to preserve its empire, and the Americans wanted something entirely different. They wanted independence. For Washington and his army, the alliance created hope. For Britain, it created another threat. And for the French, it was an opportunity to challenge the power of their longtime rival. The balance of the war was beginning to change, but victory was still far away. The British Army remained dangerous. The Royal Navy remained powerful, and the American colonies still faced years of fighting. France had entered the war, but the alliance would have to prove its value on the battlefield. The next stage would test the Americans in a completely different way. Britain was preparing a new strategy. Its attention was turning toward the South, and there, the revolution would become even more brutal. The war that had begun as a rebellion along the Atlantic coast was now spreading across continents and oceans. France had entered the fight. Britain was facing enemies around the world, and the American Revolution had become a global conflict. Subscribe for Part 7, The War Moves South.